This is not the first one. We have made last 10 minutes. Thanks for being on time. We're going to start in 1 minute and then we'll get going. Don't have to be quiet. 1 more minute of chatter.
Oh, yeah.
Oh. Yeah. Okay, one. All right, so now welcome everyone. I am so pleased to be introducing the fabulous Claire Monteleoni for her talk today. Claire came to us in 2018 as an associate professor after getting her undergraduate degree in Earth and Planetary Sciences from Harvard and her PhD and Master's in Computer Science from MIT. And you did a postdoc in UC State. Go Titans. I'm also from UC State. I didn't know a couple of things that she's done, and there are others, but we want to give the mic over to her. 2 things I want to point out is that she is the co-founder of the International Conference on Climate Informatics, which is 12 years old now. And in December 2020, she was and still is the founding editor-in-chief of Environmental Data Science, which is a Cambridge University Press journal. So those both really impressive things. And Claire, we're looking so forward to your work. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It's fun to be here talking in the department. Is everyone on Zoom happy with sound and video levels? Okay, take that as a yes. All right, so lots of chats. Did you get them? You guys? Okay. This is a photo I took this summer in Aspen. There was a Aspen Global Change Institute workshop. So we've got some infrastructure here, a bridge that humans and some wildlife are using. We've got nature, and then we have power lines. And somehow we're all going to have to figure out how to live together. Another example near and dear to all of our hearts is an example of cascading extreme events or cascading hazards that happened almost a year ago here in Boulder County, right, where we had anomalously dry fall and winter. So we actually had a snow drought, meaning that the vegetation was quite dry. Oh goodness. And I think maybe I'm gonna go and like look at the chats and be like, hi chats, there you are, good chats. And then it'll go.
If you click more, you can get rid of the top bar.
Yeah. By floating meeting controls.
Thank you. But luckily this audience knows where this happened. So we had anomalously high winds then before a snow event, but 80 to 100 miles per hour winds meant that all it took was a single ignition, and then of course we had this essentially a firestorm where embers were tossed by the wind over Route 36, our major highway, in multiple places, and suburban residential neighborhoods were completely leveled. These are not neighborhoods up in the mountains or surrounded by trees, they were surrounded by grasses. And so this is where multiple weather extremes come together and create outsized impacts. For those of you from the West Coast, in 2018, Montecito in Santa Barbara County was damaged by a massive debris flow. And honestly, I wish there was a stronger word for this kind of landslide. So there was a wildfire following, drought conditions. There was a burn scar. Sorry, is there trouble on Zoom?
You're on your presenter view.
Oh, okay. So
Don't know if you can use
I
it.
think I know how to get get that taken care of. Which is that I think I just slide this here and then I do presenter view, and then tell me if that got any better. Otherwise, I'll do mirror displays.
That looks good to me.
Is that good on Zoom? Full screen on Zoom, or am I not even sharing?
I'm supposed to it's still the same. I wouldn't stress, but can they still see it? Because if they can see, I don't want to stress.
Okay, well, they'll see what's coming next, but lucky them, that's the benefit for staying home.
Okay.
Yeah, so fire following drought, intense rainfall on the burn scar, and you got a massive debris flow. So think huge boulders coming into your living room. I mean, this was extremely dangerous. There was a lot of fatality and damage to property and infrastructure. So more generally, I work, and my group works on climate informatics due to the threat of climate change and its impacts on communities and ecosystems. I believe actually this is also from the Boulder flooding in 2013 in a mountain town in Colorado. And climate informatics is based on the vision that machine learning can shed light on climate change and help address climate change. And this view is starting to really have critical mass. So the World Economic Forum put out a call to action called AI for the Earth in 2018, saying, look, we know AI is revolutionizing economies and all sorts of industries, but some of the power of AI should be applied back to environmental challenges such as climate change. So I've been working on climate informatics for almost 15 years now, and we now have some significant critical mass in this area. In fact, the World Economic Forum report actually put forth climate informatics as a key priority and cited our work. Lots of bullets here. The main thing is that we're building a new interdisciplinary field, and some lessons we learned about how to do that. One of them was this idea of hackathons. So we would get a challenge problem from a domain scientist with a curated data set for that problem. And then we would get together students, early career, anyone who wanted to participate. And of course, industry was always very happy to pay for pizza because then we could meet our students. And then we would have different people sitting at different tables, making sure that we had someone who knew Python at every table, someone who had taken maybe a statistics or data mining or machine learning class, and then people also trained in the domain science. So this was great for industry, great for young people, but it was also great for forming these collaborations, which has since led to people getting writing papers, getting grants, getting huge institutes funded, and then also finding jobs, sometimes going from ML background to a climate science lab or vice versa, and has been critical in building the field. The other thing we realized was that if you're trying to build a new field, you need new publication venues. We couldn't expect climate scientists to show up at our top AI and machine learning conferences or vice versa. So first off, it was a standalone event that we started running. Boulder figures prominently because from year 2 to year 8, we actually were up the hill at NCAR before I even moved here. And so we started a conference with proceedings. Now, proceedings are great for computer science people. We love to publish conference proceedings, but for anybody else that we're going to collaborate, people addressing climate change, they would need to publish journal papers. So we also recently launched a journal that's even broader. So environmental data science takes kind of an AI-informed view of data science, and then addresses not only climate change, but a lot of other environmental problems. Okay, so in this survey talk for CUCS department, I'm going to talk about the 3 sort of past, ongoing, and future thrusts of my research on machine learning for climate change and environmental sustainability. And the reason why I highlighted the first 2 in a blue color, a different color from the third one, is that, okay, most people in this room are computer scientists. This just sounds like, oh, climate and weather. These are sort of one and the same thing. Well, if you talk to anyone up at NCAR, either working on weather or working on climate, they will say that they're kind of studied in different communities. But the other thing, if you think about it, is My first work in this field was working with climate scientists, climate modelers. And the first bullet about understanding and predicting climate change is where we're using ML for the service of climate science and climate modeling. The second bullet would ideally create tools to adapt to climate change. Now we've got these extremes coming in very short time frames. How do we warn communities and really adapt to the fact that climate change is already happening and I'm predicting it? And then the last bullet sort of stands in for our work on climate change mitigation. So we're really going to need to have a complete transition, certainly in the energy domain, to slow this down. And since we're a computer science department, I will just emphasize that along the way, my group always tries to work at that sweet spot where we can advance addressing climate change, but also it turns out new open problems come up and then we can address those as well. And so I won't go through these in detail, but I'll flag them when they come up in talking about those three areas. So this is my outline slide, and now let me talk about essentially ML for climate. So the state of the art in climate science involves looking at predictions, or they call it projections, from climate models. So these are physics-driven models, massive systems of non-stochastic partial differential equations interacting. Essentially, they have to model the whole atmosphere, the ocean system of oceans, land, and the cryosphere, everything, processes involving ice. There's a lot of hard problems about how and where we should couple, a lot of scale in space and time that cannot be accurately resolved and simulated. But basically you can run these models, simulate the conservations of mass and energy, and then take the temperature or check other variables into the future. So I'm going to do a short vignette on this whole line of work we have done using the output of climate models along with observations to better predict climate. But I do also want to mention that some of the things that are changing under climate change include things like the El Nino Southern Oscillation itself might be changing. Now, we already know that that corresponds with drought in some areas and flood in others. So if that's changing with respect to climate change, we need to get a handle on it. And it turns out even the original way that it was measured is sort of a historical way that was not based on machine learning. So we got to fix that. So we did some AI causal analysis type things to see what are the regions around the current ENSO index that people do follow that are kind of more predictive of the spread of these heat anomalies just within the Pacific ENSO region, and then try to use those to see if we could get more skill in predicting really hard climatological problems such as precipitation extremes of the Indian summer monsoon, which we know affect the GDP of that entire subcontinent and is notably very hard to predict. And then I will just also briefly mention, we've started ramping up with a NASA sea surface topography project where using satellite altimetry to get measurements down to millimeter accuracies of sea level height, along with the forecasts of climate models, we're trying to leverage machine learning to actually do a very ambitious goal of forecasting sea surface sea level rise trends 30 years in advance globally, and then also for specific locations of interest. So yeah, Soumya is on that project. She's sitting right there, and I'm also going to talk about her other work. Mumita was a postdoc here. Okay, so for this little short vignette about this entire line of work that we did for a while, the idea is, in machine learning, I've been interested in, okay, I take my standard machine learning class and they tell me, all right, as long as your training data is similar to your test data, we can prove some theorems. And that's because of the IID assumption. You basically assume that all the data is independently identically distributed. Now, when that assumption is broken, then standard ML can still be used, but maybe with less guarantees. And so instead we try to do, in this case, online learning, where we're basically adapting our model over time. And being ready for shifts in the observations because the data is not stationary. So this was this whole line of work. We had done it with respect to time, and then I had a PhD student who extended it to space and time because it's spatiotemporal data. So now we have non-stationarity over time and latitude and longitude, and we want to learn those levels of non-stationary simultaneous to basically taking a weighted average with the weights that we've learned over climate model predictions. This is a really simple idea. Maybe we just lay down a lot of copies of the algorithm distributed across the globe, and then they have some neighborhood relationship. That said, the neighborhood relationship could be a lot more interesting, and it could also be learned from data. Well, it turned out while there was work, I mean, I had been working on how do you learn with non-stationarity over time in the field of online learning, by the way, not deep learning, very lightweight algorithms. It was open about how to add then multiple dimensions. And, you know, for geospatial data, this could be latitude and longitude, but we did a proof of concept, you know, for financial markets. Maybe the dimensions are the markets going on in different countries. So during sabbatical, I pitched this to basically the person that wrote the book on online learning, and his theory group kind of together we came up with a regret framework that actually contributed to the algorithmic learning theory literature. So sometimes we like to take things full circle. And then a similar idea to finding and exploiting neighborhood structure in space, we could also basically exploit similarity of tasks in time. So the big kind of question that the climate modelers were not looking at and the weather scientists were not looking at was seasonal to subseasonal, which is from 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, it becomes subseasonal climate out to 3 or 6 months. And there are these modelers that did start to look at it, and they would create a bunch of different predictions. So at January, I would predict for February, March, April, all the way through the end of the year. But then in February, I would again output 11 months, 11 different predictions. So if we take the idea of multitask learning in machine learning, where we've got 11 different goals, the prediction at each of those different lead times, and then we share influence among the different tasks in our learning, we actually were able to show that we had improved performance for every task versus learning them independently, except for the task at the shortest prediction window, because the shortest prediction window is operating on the most recent data. And so it's not going to gain a lot by seeing more stale data, but all the other tasks were helped by using a multitask learning approach. Turned out this was also interesting for a financial volatility application. Okay, so moving right along, the second main topic is machine learning for extreme weather. And I put, you know, Boulder and Santa Barbara, those terrible cascading hazards with outsized impacts, as the inspiration. Where we need to get to, we needed solutions yesterday, but let's also just start with, you know, forecasting and detecting individual extremes. Of course, coupling them is the frontier. I first want to, so I'm going to briefly mention what this picture is here, but I just want to mention a past work that was quite interesting. You know, it was with Latent-Dirichlet allocation, which is a version of Bayesian hierarchical clustering that has been used in topic modeling and natural language processing. But more generally, it was a proof of concept that unsupervised learning has actually something to offer in this domain. Because in existing literature on what is an extreme, you would see, okay, when temperature gets above a certain amount, that's extreme. Or if heat gets above a threshold and stays it above that threshold for threshold 2 number of days, then we have, so this is very chunky and blocky, not probabilistic, and it was generally univariate. But, you know, everything that we showed before with the confluence of winds and dryness, we had to look at multiple variables really for extremes, and also past work would find extremes of just a single type. Like there's a drought severity index that just looks for drought. So this was really nice, it's a probabilistic clustering approach where the climate topics we discovered, some of them would correspond to just normal weather as usual, but within that small set of completely unsupervised learned topics, we could examine some and say, oh, it's a very wet event with a certain pressure structure, or find a very dry event. So we're actually able to detect and define in a probabilistic and multivariate way extremes, which is important for then tracking them. We'll briefly mention this. Sophie, who some of you may have remembered was a postdoc here, led this really interesting project where using historical data of storm tracks, where we have X, Y, like lat, long coordinates every 6 hours of the center of the storm, she registered images around the center of the track. Now, I'm putting images in quotes. We steal a lot from computer vision. These are not your standard camera images. This is just a real valued field. So we've got our UV wind fields and our pressure fields. And we looked at several geopotential heights. And so she, at each point in a storm, centered the data around that, and then showed that we could fuse these different data modalities. So past tracks, which is not an image, pressure and U and V wind, which are all sort of different surfaces, by pre-training multiple CNNs to predict what's my displacement going to be. So what's my new lat long location, and then doing just some final fine tuning to learn some connected layers to do the fusion. That method has been competitive with state of art at both 6 and 24-hour lead times. And so we basically would not want to replace the people at the National Hurricane Center, but give them yet another tool to look at, because what we saw was sometimes the ML would predict that a storm would turn before the other kinds of models were predicting that. So that was, it's more creative in some ways. Also just want to mention that that work I was referring to and some other work on Indian summer monsoon, we've now worked also with IMD in India, and they're getting AI into some of their modules for this very hard prediction task, which has so much impact on the GDP of that subcontinent. And now I'm going to do the deepest dive of the day into avalanche detection. We did a supervised CNN version, but I'm going to talk about the unsupervised version. And this was led by Soumya and also Sophie, who was a postdoc here, and it was in collaboration with Météo France. So IMD and Météo France are like NOAA for India and France, respectively. So that's how we have impact. So Météo France sends people into the Alps, trekking around looking for avalanche deposits. So evidence that an avalanche has fallen on snow. They do a few of these missions, they're quite dangerous, and that's ground truth data taken on the ground. And then we have satellite products. We were using synthetic aperture radar. So we have these satellite imagery of the same region. And you can think of us as having, a lot of this and very few labels. So this is going to be classic semi-supervised learning, where you want to learn as much as you can from the unlabeled data. You might ask if we had an in-between product. SAR images that were human labeled or human segmented. We did not. They claimed it was hard even for humans to look at a SAR image and see where the texture of the snow was different such that an avalanche had fallen. And so they did not have that at the time. I believe they said they would try to start training experts to do that. But from an ML perspective, what do we have? Well, we have class imbalance. The avalanche deposits were quite rare in the imagery. But in addition to class imbalance, we just had some fixed amount of labeled data that was small, and we weren't going to be able to get any more. So we couldn't do active learning. It was basically semi-supervised learning with a severe class imbalance. Okay, so we've got a rare event here, so let's view this as anomaly detection. And, you know, there had been techniques in the literature that would learn an unsupervised model on the negative examples, and that way you'd have a model of non-avalanche. I'll explain the VAE model in a second, but you get a model of the non-avalanche image patches. But then ultimately, there does have to be a decision, anomaly or no anomaly. So we'll have this outer wrapper that is taking an unseen image, passing it through the trained model, and seeing how well the model can reconstruct it based on the training data. And so if that reconstruction error is high, we'd say we have an avalanche. The only issue here is that going back to our situation where we have a very small amount of labeled data, we really just want to be very cognizant of that. So we don't want to waste any labeled examples before item 2. But to do item 2, you would need to use labeled examples to find negative image patches. So our twist is to say, you know what? Let's just do a variant of number 2 where we train a VAE on unlabeled examples. So there's no labeling step first. We just train on image patches. And it turns out actually this approach did well and actually did better than what may have been done in the literature. Okay, so I think
Claire, just to clarify,
Yeah.
so you're saying that avalanche images would also be in there?
yes.
Okay.
But then they all, after learning, they each get their error threshold fine-tuned. That's kind of the key. Okay, so I'm gonna take like a 7-minute detour to teach you guys about deep unsupervised learning. Okay, just an autoencoder though. So an autoencoder is a very dumb machine. Once an autoencoder is trained, it's like giving you an identity function, but a noisy version. You take in like a black and white pixel map of a human trying to write a digit. These weights have been trained to then output something as similar as possible to it. Who needs an identity function, let alone a noisy function? We don't. It is what is called a pretext task. And this is probably the biggest, most transformational idea currently in the field of unsupervised learning, deep unsupervised learning. So the task is, okay, we're learning all these weights, you know, don't worry too much about them, to push the output of the network to be close to the input of the network. If you're familiar with supervised deep learning, right, that's via gradient descent on some objective function, but this objective function is pushing the input to be close to the output for this task. And at the end, we've got this useless model. The use, though, is that if we've sent if we have an architecture with a bottleneck, then the weights learned at this bottleneck layer you could view as a compressed representation of the data that you trained on. So that's the whole point. You know, here's another way to look at a dense autoencoder. So training is training all these weights in here to get the output of the network close to the input. But the point is you've squeezed through a bottleneck. So you've kind of reduced the dimension of your data, and we'll call that latent representation. Quick note for those across campus in cognitive science or neuroscience, one can also use wide autoencoders. You project to a higher dimensional space because then you'll have sparse encodings. Sparse representation. So for a fruit fly or maybe even a human trying to do cognition, they might want to have different signals stored very far from each other when they're learning kind of the state of the world. So side note, wide autoencoders often exist, probably in an applied setting where you care about efficiency and smaller representations, you'll see these dense autoencoders. And then where does the V come from in VAE? Well, I'm not going to go entirely into that, but we want a distribution now over these representations. And so we can, for the standard VAE, fit a Gaussian, the parameters of a Gaussian over latent space, and then allows us to have like a whole distribution over latent representation. Okay, so back to the story of Soumya's paper. What we were saying would standardly happen in the literature is first you would look at your SAR data, you would look at that ground truth survey of people trekking, and you would label images, and then you would train, this is the autoencoder, you're going to train all these weights to push the output close to the input, but just on patches that have been labeled negative, no avalanche deposits. Okay. What we will compare this step to is not doing this step and actually just training an autoencoder on image patches that we haven't checked the ground truth survey, so we don't know if there's an avalanche in them. Okay. So those are kind of two alternate ways of training the autoencoder. We'll call this one the unsupervised and this one the semi-supervised, because you have to supervise to even get negative images. But in both cases, I did mention this threshold, because there's going to be this wrapper that's going to give me a supervised answer, avalanche, no avalanche. And the standard way that we tune a hyperparameter, and the threshold now is the hyperparameter, is that we have to use labeled data for that. Because we have to know, okay, these patches did not have avalanche deposits and those patches did. I don't change the weights at all of the learned autoencoder, but I just fiddle with this threshold until on my labeled validation data set, I'm labeling most of the avalanche images as avalanche and the non-avalanche images as non-avalanche. So that's how I choose the threshold. And I'll do this once for each of the models, for the model that was trained only on negative and for the other model. How do I use this whole pipeline then? Well, if a test image or an image where I don't know the answer comes in, I'll send it through the trained model, compute the difference of reconstruction error between the input and the output, compare it to the tuned threshold, and that tells me what label to give. Okay, so as I kind of intimated earlier on, both of these methods actually outperformed past work. So past work was either not using AI, some kind of thresholding rules that were being used at Métier de France, that's what we're calling baseline, or using supervised convolutional neural network, which was also a previous paper of Soumya, where we had to artificially balance the data set by just not using any more negative examples than we had positive examples in our training set, so kind of a more modest training set. So we said this task is hard for even humans, so don't really worry about the values of the numbers, but just the relative values that we get some lift by using that first standard version where we train on negative examples, but significantly more lift in various measures by training completely unsupervised. So this might seem unintuitive at first, but the unsupervised VAE gets to be trained on more data. And if you've taken ML, you know that at least in the supervised setting, training on more data generally helps you generalize better and reduces overfitting. Also, there's more diversity in the data. There could be avalanches in the data, but it means that you're exploring the feature space more. And critically, at the end of training, they each independently, but on the same labeled validation set, get to tune their threshold. So the values of the thresholds are probably going to be different. But the one that had a more diverse training and larger training set outperformed. So that was the end of that vignette, but it's a sort of more general twist that can be applied to any anomaly detection problems with extremely limited data. And we would advocate, if you have such a problem, lean as much as you can on the unsupervised part and store that label data only for the hyperparameter tuning. Okay. The other interesting thought is calling this a virtual sensor. So eventually, if there's a good model for this, we don't have to send trekkers into the most dangerous avalanche regions. And there's a lot of other applications of this, and some of these have to do with equity. So a paper, an opinion piece came out actually in our journal by the AI Institute on trustworthy AI for climate and weather. And there was a really striking figure. So radar, as we know it, the radar maps that we check for our weather, are actually quite expensive, and they have some radius of operation. There's this striking figure where you see these circles on the map of the continental US of where we have radar coverage. And superimposed, we see BIPOC and people of color communities, especially in the American South, and most of them are not even covered by radar. So if we're not even measuring weather around certain populations, how could we, possibly do adaptations or warnings that will not put them into a path of, a vulnerable, climate disaster. But maybe, okay, so ideally government gives money to put radar over all the communities. Second best, we can use AI to take a ubiquitous data source like various remote sensing products, learn a model using the radar where we have it as our labels, and then the trained model can generate kind of fake or proxy radar in the places that we don't. Okay. So, and then the last, I'm just doing kind of small vignettes, and actually this one also only has a small vignette. But the last main topic is really about mitigation and adaptation. So we can improve predictions, but can we use AI in such a way that will help with the green transition? And so far, I've been working mostly on the green energy transition because we're really lucky in our ACE department to have people from the National Renewable Energy Lab. And one thing we did was a forecasting task. Soumya again used deep sequence learning techniques to try to forecast the amount of solar irradiance that will get translated into solar power by our solar panels. Because if you have a lot of uncertainty on when these are going to be producing, and you're a grid operator, that just translates to cost. Because you're not going to know when you're going to be able to count on solar or wind if there's a lot of uncertainty on predicting their effectiveness. We tried to predict at a few minutes to an hour in advance, and AI cannot do much better than the idea of persistence, which is saying, given the meteorological conditions and the amount of solar radiance now, in 15 minutes, I predict it'll be the same. That actually does better than the fanciest ML. But it turns out there is a niche where numerical weather prediction is only making a prediction every like 10 or 11 days. So there's a niche for week ahead to 2 week to sub-seasonal forecasts, and our methods outperformed NWP for this. The other thing I want to mention, this is a project that NIDN is on, is a project recently funded by Climate Change AI and Future Earth, where we're collaborating with NREL and also with IIT Roorkee in India. And the idea is, so say we do want to do renewable energy planning, and there's a lot of information if we're planning in the future that we only have in climate models because we haven't observed the future, but climate models are really the only lens into the future that we have. So we want to downscale the data because climate models are modeling the whole world. But for any area of impacts or mitigation, we generally need to downscale. And the idea is that in the US, we could downscale in a supervised manner. We have very fine resolution data and very coarse resolution data. But we can also use that setting to validate our unsupervised downscaling methods. So we have unsupervised learning downscaling methods that once they're validated in the US in this data-rich environment, we can then port them to India, which doesn't have as much granularity of data. So I will just briefly mention, so NIDN actually has some forthcoming work on this. But the reason why we thought that we could do this was based on some work by a master's student, Brian, who loved this field so much, he went off and he's doing a PhD in climate science. But he worked on a general technique to do downscaling. That's where you go from a map, say precipitation or temperature, or the two cases we did, that you have a coarse grid and you want a fine grid. That's the task of downscaling. and there's a whole literature on this in climate, but we found that from the point of view of AI, there were a few things lacking. First off, it was supervised. So if I'm going to train a method for statistical downscaling, I need the coarse grid map and its corresponding fine grid map. If I get a lot of such pairs, then I can use those methods. In ours, we don't need the maps to be paired. We just need access to coarse grid data and fine grid data for the same field, but we don't have to know that they're temporally paired. Also, if you take one of these techniques, you give it a coarse grid map, it outputs a fine grid map. We would call that a deterministic or point prediction. I mean, it's a lot of points, all the points in the map, but it's not a distribution over such maps. So we wanted to do generative learning. And also we wanted it to be somewhat interpretable. Now, it's hard to interpret, what that posterior distribution is that you've learned over your latent space. But one thing that people have been doing is interpolation. And so after training the model, Brian did a demonstration of that here. So the model, after being trained, is given this fine resolution precipitation image from one time, and this other fine resolution precipitation image from another time. And what it does is it maps using the learned parameters, which are implement something called a normalizing flow, which I'll mention briefly, down to the latent space, and then conditioned on that image, samples an image at coarse resolution. Oh, by the way, everything can go in both directions. This is maybe not a use case. You might not want to go from fine to coarse, but you could go in both directions. Then it takes a walk in latent space, connecting the two mapped points, and can generate coarse or fine grid images. And so we can visualize this as how the model views the interpolation of precipitation maps at these two endpoints at both fine and coarse resolutions. As a side note, there's an entire field now on how to even take this walk in latent space. You've learned a posterior now, you're walking into geodesic. Techniques from optimization are coming in because now there's the efficiency of even walking that geodesic. And then the other thing is that, of course, we could sample, like conditionally on this image, I can sample as many of these as I want by sampling the conditional posterior and the latent space. So this was by extending this idea, aligned flow that lies heavily on the idea of normalizing flows. And to close the loop on the intro lesson to unsupervised deep learning, I do want to mention normalizing flows because it makes kind of a satisfying conclusion to the VAE story. So the variational autoencoder, first off, doesn't output a proper density, and second, it's just going to be a Gaussian. A normalizing flow is quite similar. It's a pretext task trying to push the input image close to the output image. But under the hood, while you might start from a simple prior, like a uniform or a Gaussian, you learn a series of transformations that can complicate this prior to fit your data better. And as long as these bijections that we're learning the parameters of, as long as these functions are bijections, then when we compose them, kind of all the math for the inference still works out on a very simple prior, yet we get a more informative distribution over the latent space. If you're worried about overfitting, okay, we still regularize, and I should have mentioned in the VAE, we try to make sure simultaneously that we don't go too far away from our prior. There's a regularization term. So the idea of aligned flow is learning normalizing flow mapping from one of your data sources, say your coarse resolution, to a latent space, and separately learn a normalizing flow from your, say, fine resolution data to the same latent space as a way to approximate the joint distribution over coarse and fine, and then you can sample from it any which way you want. So I'm going to close down now shortly to leave time for questions, but in terms of getting back to what open problems we addressed, so during the course of these studies, we've added multiple dimensions or spatiotemporal non-stationarity to kind of the canon of what online learning can address. Online learning is like suddenly really hot again, which is great for like me, Rob, and Bill. But yeah, apparently it's good for placing advertisements on like a web page, but we're using it for climate. And then anomaly detection with limited supervision was sort of the punchline of that approach from the avalanche paper. And then one thing I would leave more as an open unchecked box is this is tracking highly deformable patterns is to remind me to talk about what we can and can't take from computer vision. So computer vision does study spatiotemporal data. It studies videos. And it uses a lot of nice things about videos that are not true for this climate and weather data. So in videos, you have a foreground and a background. When you have a deformable object, it's like me walking or a cat. It is not an ephemeral convection storm that dissipates. And so there's some parts of computer vision we can harness, but then there's a lot of open problems. So new machine learning papers. So I will just summarize in terms of what we've addressed and what is still open. So we've addressed that you have, maybe less and less labeled data. Can you lean more on unsupervised learning, and how also to deal with class imbalance? One thing that's kind of unfortunate in this domain is that we have no counterfactual Earth. So we can't do some change in 1950 and watch what would happen, other than in climate model world, but we can't actually do that. So we have so much instrumentation right now, if you also consider like remote sensing and things being measured in the ocean, but it only came online in the past few hundred years. So we're increasingly, though, at the moment, and not us necessarily, because it's often private or governmental data, but having extremely high granularity spatial data. So could we kind of substitute the amount and granularity and diversity that we lack over time? Can we substitute that for this massive amount of fine resolution spatial data? Because then maybe in some regions there was a climate intervention done. And so it'll help us reason about what we might want to do in the future. I mentioned a little bit scale resolution challenges and our work on unsupervised generative downscaling, which is extremely general. We showed it for temperature or precipitation, but it's increasingly going to be important to go from the climate models that inform the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, on global climate change, to the resolution of data that decision makers need to do to mitigate and actually adapt locally to impacts. And some people are working on this via putting machine learning under the hood. There's this whole field on climate model emulators and parameterization. My group is still really interested in non-stationarity. This keeps coming up. It definitely still keeps coming up in the stock market and maybe other domains. And then finally, interpretability. You'll notice my little lesson about generative unsupervised learning focused on the VAE normalizing flow dimension. I did not talk about GANs. So GANs do not have a posterior distribution over a latent representation. It's they don't even really have latent representation. And Amit has been pointing out some problems where if you look at like celebrity faces, and then you look at the cherry-picked, beautiful fake faces that have been generated, they often fall in a neat little kernel right around an existing celebrity face. Or you can do these cool interpolations between any two faces, but we can't say anything definitive about whether the distribution generated by, say, a GAN matches reality. State of art in theory is one baby step, which is there's a test you can do to make sure that your GAN has not memorized the training data. But at one end of the extreme, there's a small positive result. But this is especially important for the trust of anyone interpreting these results. I've been to talks at like the top climate science conferences where people go up and make a lot of cloud images that again generated or precipitation maps. And it's a great talk. It's really entertaining and interesting. And then at the end they say future works. Try to quantify how well this distribution of clouds that I can generate matches the distribution in reality. And that's actually open in AI. And then, yeah, just to leave us with some long-term motivations, I mentioned, and I guess this audience doesn't need to be reminded about the Marshall Fire. We needed solutions yesterday to not only forecasting extremes, but also how they couple and lead to these, outsized impacts. And then coming back to climate justice, any AI research or intervention that we do should never make things worse. Hopefully they'll increase equity, in particular, in this case, climate equity. But as really a goalpost, we want to strive for approaches that help undo the legacy of climate injustice. So with that, I will thank everybody. Actually, I was supposed to say that if you want to get involved, you can go across campus because Earth Lab's work has been extended and recognized by the National Science Foundation with a new Earth Data Science Innovation and Inclusion Lab, and there are going to be a lot of in-person events and working groups and summits. And so with your CS skills, I would strongly encourage you to go work across campus with people at Ceres who have really interesting ecological and climate problems. And if you are already working on EDS, please submit to the journal. All right, thanks.
So I found this idea of measuring the reconstruction error of a VAE somewhat disturbing, right? I mean, all it means is that whatever input you're giving is somehow not being reconstructed, right? It could be that the image has some new features that fail to reconstruct. So how do you conclude that it's a negative example, or
that's a really good point. Yeah, I've heard a version, and I don't know, I won't attribute this to you because I heard it from someone else. A variant of this question was, what if it's like a caribou or, not an avalanche? So in this application, we were pretty lucky that it's just images of snow with a slight change of texture for the avalanche deposit or not an avalanche deposit. But say there were multiple kinds of an anomaly, like avalanche deposit, or maybe complete melt or partial melt where you can start to see the sticks and the snow. I could imagine either having more hyperparameters either studying kind of like more dimensions of anomalousness, or along the single dimension, you could imagine having multiple regimes, multiple thresholds. Or if you don't like thresholds, it could be maybe like a mixture of Gaussians, and then you've got inference rules and etc. But yeah, that's a good point. That for very simple problems like, is there, not simple, there's a lot of impactful problems like, is there slash and burn in this part of the Amazon? And the products that we're talking about, this might be applicable, but I can also imagine settings where you would need to complicate your decision rule.
There is one in the chat.
Oh. Who was it? They could maybe speak, or do you want to just let me in?
Hey, thank you for the speech. I have a question. So it's still about the reconstruction error of VAE. So we reconstruct the data from VAE.
Wait, there is a way to, okay, sorry, start again, please. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. So my question is, when we reconstruct data from VAE, we are actually sample a latent Gaussian, and it could possibly deviate from its true latent representation. So how can we trust the reconstruction error from VAE, not the AE?
Yeah. We could sample multiple times, get some quantiles. Somia has tried all sorts of things. This is kind of an oversimplification. You could maybe say that we would redefine a reconstruction error on some estimate of the distribution that we can conditionally generate from the input. But that's a nice point. But on the flip side, if we're only going to sample once, then a non-representative image is, of course, only going to happen with very low probability.
I see. So it's like by the law of large number, we can sample a lot and compute it.
Well, yeah, we can sample a lot. You know, sometimes we use these sorts of actually, one thing my group is really interested in now is probabilistic forecasts. And if you had like a latent representation, you could sample multiple times. If you just have like a feed forward network, of course, you would just use like a soft max over a bunch of different options. But and actually been talking about ROF, how we have no good ways to evaluate these in non-stationary settings. Because, you know, measures such as CRPS and even just RMSE always assume IID data. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up uncertainty. And yeah, I think we can take a discussion about that offline.
Thank you.
Aaron.
In the non-stationary setting, you're trying to do forecasting. There's been some work done on like ensemble learning and trying to minimize regret and stuff like that. Is that relevant here? Are ensembles standard part, or have neural networks sort of demolished the ensemble learning?
Yeah, so there's been some work, including my work on ensemble learning and minimizing regret. And this little thing, which I didn't zoom into, you may have seen more about when I came and talked in DLC in spring of 2016 or 17, is based on that, and then extending this idea to multiple dimensions and similarity across time. So I still actually, and I think Roth is with me in advocating for online learning when possible, especially so the whole elephant in the room that I didn't talk about is the carbon footprint of the compute itself. But here's one thing that's really cool about working in my domain is that the climate model carbon footprint is very high. And then when we use machine learning to replace some of the aspects, we can get it lower. But yes, if we can point people to, you don't need to use deep learning for some of these things. And often with non-stationarity, you don't want to be using batch methods. You want to, basically the idea of this is I've got my ensemble of IPCC climate models. I'm gonna, start with high entropy and then reduce entropy on one predicting well. But that's kind of my exploit. And I always want to mix in some explore, mix in the uniform distribution over all the other possible good conditions suddenly change. And then the fraction that I should explore versus exploit is what we call the level of non-stationarity that we're also actually estimating. Okay, can't say no to Rick.
Can you speak more on this framework for online learning? Is this I've learned some of your work with the graphs in online learning. Is there this is just something else?
Yeah, this is where the graphs. Well, okay. Basically, for the AI and climate community, we came up with algorithms. For the theory community, mostly Tommaso Cesare came up with a new regret framework and proved some negative and positive results.
Would you want to take one more question?
Well, we can thank me again and then I'll talk to Raf.
Is that?
Yeah.
Looks like people are still waiting for the questions. We can actually, I don't know what you wanna do, but.
Well, I just thought it would be interesting for the, the NLP folks in the audience to know more about that topic modeling. So usually topic modeling is like this generative process, but I was just wondering,
Yeah,
like, what was the generative process that you used for a topic model in the, I think it was the hurricane. What was that from?
it was, this general idea, so. Take a bunch of climatological variables like specific humidity, precipitable water, sea level, surface level pressure, and other stuff that climate scientists know what they are. Take 7 of those. And then discretize them based on their regular behavior in the region. You could do low, medium, and high. In our case, we did, 5 classes. So 1 is quite low for that year and region, and 5 is quite high. Then you take observations, you bin them up,
Right.
and then you learn the distributions. And a few of the topics were interpretable as extremes. Some of the topics were like, hey, everything's in a 3 state. That's a pretty common situation. But you could discover different kinds of topics. Then what you could do is you could take this heat wave topic and you could plot it on a particular year and see if the Sahel flared up in the 70s when it was having, heat waves and droughts. But yeah, that said, I would also want to try other versions of unsupervised learning.
Okay, let's think of
Now
our
you're
third.
really
Question on the end that was asking.